and we're following and weighing in on a good number of issues, which we've been apprising most of you that get our advocacy update multiple times a week. And our point person in the Statehouse, Jessica Oskey, is going to be updating us on those issues in part 2 of this hour that we've got here. But first, with that CUNA GAC that I referenced coming up this next weekend, we thought it'd be good to provide a high-level summary of key issues also being tracked for credit unions inside the Beltway. And here to do that for us, we're fortunate to have Courtney Ryan, who is Director of Advocacy at CUNA, where she's been for almost a year, coming up this spring, I think it is, in April or so. Before her appointment at CUNA, she held a number of different roles for over about, 15-year period or so in various, I think it's federal election campaign related organizations. And so it's very active in that scene and all the goings on inside the Beltway. So thank you, Courtney, for joining us this afternoon. And hey, congratulations, even though it's been almost a year, congratulations on your new role at CUNA. We greatly appreciate having you with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and to all of you who are on today and are going to join us in DC next week. We look forward to seeing you for sure. Hopefully DC's weather is a little bit better for you when you get here next week. Wildly is going to be 80 degrees here this week and then back down into the 40s. It's
just in time for our arrival.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for that.
Yes, of course. So Joe, if it's okay, I'm just going to launch into kind of an overview of some of these federal issues that are affecting credit unions, give a little bit of legislative history when it's necessary, but happy to take questions at any point, Joe, that you tell me it's okay. But with that said, look, so again, really excited to see everybody in DC next week. I know, the conference itself and the programming there is wonderful. I'd also like to just put in a plug for the Hill visit. I understand that the team is going to do while you're in town. I think that you have a small but very mighty delegation for sure. And, I think that the stories that advocates like yourselves can tell to members and their teams, over the course of time really make a huge difference. They make these issues stand out when decisions are being made. So I don't want, I would just like to put in a plug for that kind of storytelling opportunity that you have in front of the delegations next week. With that said, here we go. Let's jump in. So a couple of the issues, some are perennial issues, if you will, and then a couple are kind of nuanced and up and coming here. So one of the things that I'll just mention that's always just on the top of mind when talking to members of Congress is just making sure that the credit union tax status is preserved. It kind of just honestly just goes without saying, but I'll just mention it at the top here to kick us off. The good news, right, is that there have been no whispers. There was no concern in the last Congress. Just one of those things that we want to continue to remain incredibly vigilant about. So, I know it doesn't seem like it's anyone in your delegation that's an issue, but just, always want to make sure that we're on top of that. And, we have checked in with numerous sources, and it doesn't seem that there's anybody trying to necessarily go after it this Congress. But again, just kind of always issue number one. Issue number two that I'll mention is interchange. So, and I know your delegation has a special role to play in that, Senator Welch, but I'll just go here and let me talk a little bit of legislative history and then what we expect in this Congress and maybe some of the messages I know unique to your delegation, but that I'm frankly telling every credit union advocate that's coming to DC next week about interchange. So interchange, we're talking about credit card routing mandates, and the the history here is that last Congress there's a bill called the Credit Card Competition Act that was introduced, but did not pass, but it was introduced in both the House and the Senate late last year. It was introduced by Senators Durbin and Marshall in the House. You may know Senator Durbin from Illinois is number 2 Democrat in the Senate. He is very skilled at what he does. He has been at this for a really long time, and so the competition, I don't know, there is fierce, right? For sure. He knows what he's doing. So, and then in the House, it was introduced, of course, by, at the time, Congressman Welch and Congressman Gooden. So, and then of course, they tried to attach it to many pieces of must-pass legislation. The good news, I think, for us is that, it didn't really move forward other than introduction. And also, I think it's notable is that the names that I mentioned were the only names on those bills. It wasn't in either chamber, it didn't have a ton of co-sponsors, right? So there's not a huge amount of initial outward support for this. So of course we like to keep it that way this Congress. So, but just moving into what it looks like now, we do expect, again, Senator Durbin knows what he's doing, and now he has a partner in the Senate, potentially in now Senator Welch, to move forward on this. We expect, of course, that it will be introduced again this Congress. Don't exactly know when, but we think it'll be fairly early this year. And then it just gives them some opportunities, particularly with makeup of Congress right now being pretty tight on both sides. I think there's a lot of must-pass legislation that gets a lot of addition, like these rider bills, these amendments added on. And our understanding is that's probably what Senator Durbin is going to look to do. So it's just right now remaining incredibly vigilant, making sure that there's nobody else in any delegation across the country that is unclear about how we feel about it, A, and then B, make it so unpalatable for them to sign on to help move this thing forward. So again, the piece there is just, oppose any interchange legislation that may come across their desks, right?
If I can ask a question, Courtney, just real quick. Do you think that just from a strategy perspective, do you think that the fact that the two, I don't know if I'd say most outspoken, but point people are now both in the same chamber? What do you suppose happens in the House? I mean, I'm sure there are others who are supportive and whatnot, but Peter from Vermont in the House was definitely the merchant kind of poster child when it came to House members. And so the fact that he's now in the Senate, what happens in the House, you think?
Yeah, great question. And I don't think anybody fully knows the answer to that right now, because you're right, there isn't an obvious interchange champion in the House at the moment. We've heard of some names floated around, but honestly, they're not folks that are, some are just new to Congress and, don't necessarily have a financial services committee, assignment, which is not a requirement, of course, but just things that we're thinking through when you're looking at the strength of a bill or piece of legislation that will come through. So I think probably Senators Durbin and Welch and maybe Marshall are still looking for some takers on the House side, honestly. And I think, right, one of the messages is Congresswoman Ballant, don't do it.
Right.
So, I think just keeping the pressure on heavy on interchange is really important. And I think that the stories that, if you have the opportunity to share with members or their staff, I think is really, really valuable next week on interchange. But certainly keep you updated if anything moves on it. But I don't think there's anything like incredibly immediate that's about to happen. But
Sure.
we just want to make sure we're prepared. And the good news, right, is there's a huge coalition of folks that are with us on this.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Another issue I'll mention straight at the top here is overdraft protection. That's another one where kind of the same message, right? Like to Congress is oppose any sort of overdraft protection that comes your way. But it is not as organized of a issue as interchange. So there is no House bill or Senate bill that is imminent that we are aware of right now. There was a House bill on the legislative history front. There's a House bill that was introduced last year, but the sponsor of that, the lead person on that, has since retired. So there's no obvious House or Senate lead on it at this moment in time. We expect that there will be at some point, but you know, again, just one of these where we're just being incredibly vigilant on it. There's no, I think, immediate cause for concern. But again, I think just a reminder across the board to, you know, how credit unions feel about this, why, and, you know, to oppose anything that might come down the pike later this year or next year.
I may be mistaken on this, but
Yeah.
it seems like some of the, I guess I'll say opponents or maybe proponents of overdraft reform that I've read about here and there seem to be, and maybe I'm misreading things, seem to be trying to, you know, paint overdraft protection with the same brush as payday lenders in some way and throw it into that kind of bucket.
Yeah, absolutely right, Joe. And I think our message, right, continues to be like, allow credit unions to serve their members well by offering, if they choose these services, and keep the members out of the hands of payday lenders. Show the distinction there.
Right.
For sure.
It's interesting in Vermont. We have, and people on the call with us know this, but you might not. We have, and Jessica's going to talk about it a little later. We have an active effort to license earned wage access providers in Vermont right now. And it would be, if passed, it would be the first state in the country to do that legislatively. And I know there's an effort on the regulatory side in California right now, but there's nothing official yet. And although it's not the same as overdraft protection, I think, you know, it's some of the same people that as far as, you know, Americans that are in that kind of category, that, you know, there are those people who probably, you know, use it, you know, repeatedly and kind of go down a rabbit hole sort of when it gets out of control. And perhaps that's the case for some people with overdraft protection, as it is with earned wage access providers and, you know, payday lending, which is the extreme. But there are those people who, you know, rely on it, and reliably so, you know, on a recurring basis, and you know, make good use of it. So I think there's an argument to be made by every credit union for the overdraft protection that they provide to whatever members utilize it.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'll move into a different issue if that's okay, Joe?
Yeah, please do.
So the next kind of bucket of issues or potential legislation I put together as modernizing federal credit union service, modernizing the Federal Credit Union Act. So one of those will be expanding field of membership. You might remember there was a bill last Congress, the Expanding Financial Access for Underserved Communities Act, that did pass the House, but unfortunately did not make it across the finish line in the Senate. There is likely to be a similar bill introduced this year in the House. Might have some tweaks just to make sure that Chairman McHenry of the House, now the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, kind of frankly allows it to make it through his committee. But it'll look pretty similar. And it was introduced in the Senate, like I said, last year, but didn't make it over the finish line. I hope that, you know, we get it introduced in the Senate again pretty quickly once the House version is ready. But that'll be another big piece, you know, expanding field of membership, particularly in, you know, banking desert areas, et cetera. So that's one to look out for. And I think to the extent that there's anything you want to share with members on that. The Credit Union Board Modernization Act is also, I would say, in this category of, you know, this is a bill that makes it so that credit unions can offer, or rather boards can meet instead of 12 times, they can meet 6 times a year, so long as they're high performing. This already passed the House this year. Nice and quick right out of the gate, bipartisan support. We would love to see that introduced. Our understanding is that it will be introduced, in fact, next week. But we'd love to see that kind of make it through the Senate with, you know, that same kind of bipartisan spirit and speed. I have unfortunately low confidence that the Senate does anything with any sort of real speed, but I'd love to be proven wrong on that. But again, I think these are good, like small fix, like seemingly small fixes that we can share how, you know, if they're going to make a big difference to your members and sharing those stories. So there's that. There's a loan maturities bill that would raise the loan length from 15 to 20 years. Again, if you look at the text of this bill, it's like 3 sentences. It's very straightforward and quick, just moving 15 to 20. And so we hope that bill will, it was introduced last Congress. Our hope is that it'll be introduced again very soon in the Senate in particular. Our understanding is that it is slated for a March introduction date. So good to keep these credit union specific bills moving, get some momentum behind them. And I think, again, just mentioning these things to members so that they know it's a priority of yours is really important. And then a couple other bills that, you know, again, I think are lots of wide coalition support, not just credit unions, but, you know, there's the Safe Banking Act, the Cannabis Banking Act is one to mention. It really felt like it had some legs at the end of the last Congress and then unfortunately fizzled in the Senate for a multitude of reasons. But, you know, I think that there's a lot of support to get that moving again quickly in the beginning of this Congress. I think that, and it's already passed the House like something like 8 times. So, you know, because of the now Republicans control the House, I don't think that that's even frankly an issue. It's just more about getting it on the calendar and getting it moving. There's also, of course, plenty of conversation around crypto and what that looks like in this Congress. You know, there's plenty of, I say plenty, I don't know, a handful of bills that were introduced in the last Congress that frankly didn't go anywhere. I think there's just a lot of differing opinions still on what that looks like. There's been already a hearing in the Senate, Senate Banking Committee on it this year. I think you'll see a lot of movement on that, but to the extent that you have, you know, anything you want to share, I think next week is a good timely opportunity to do so, because I think that there's not a lot of consensus just yet on what needs to be done from a legislative perspective.
Along those lines, Courtney, I saw something, I think it was last week, about Senator Warren trying to mount I won't say anti-crypto campaign, but definitely put some regulatory constraints on it. And is she just kind of like a lone wolf out there on that, or do you think there's much she'll get much traction?
You know, I think she's somebody that's not afraid to be a lone wolf, but I'm not sure that she is on this one. You know, Chairman Brown of the Senate, Chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, has definitely expressed interest in doing his own bill on it. And I think he's a skeptic for sure. And I think, you know, I know Gillibrand and Lummis have a bill that they're going to reintroduce the same as last Congress. So there's a lot of people looking at it. I think it's kind of like a sexy topic right now, honestly. And like everybody is interested in getting their hands dirty in it, frankly. But even outside of us, I think it's just like there's a lot of conversation just organically happening right now. So to the extent you want to put your mark on it,
right.
It's certainly at the top of people's minds there on the Hill.
Probably because there's such a lack of understanding.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot of people. Right.
Yes. Okay, so that was kind of the list that I like, the initial kind of top list that I had, but I'm happy, Joe, if there's other issues that you'd like me to go over or anything else, I'm of course happy to do so.
So because it's so early in this Congress, and because of just the air, there, none of these are pieces of legislation that we can go in and say, vote for S whatever or H whatever or something like that.
Right.
But they're all issues kind of floating in the ether out there that are, some of which may be more likely to be introduced than others. So we can certainly express our opinion on those kinds of areas and whatnot. But like you said at the beginning, when in Hill visits where we don't have a specific, ask that's, vote for such and such, we've kind of relied on credit unions represented by folks here to tell stories about, what great things they do in their communities or what they're seeing happen in the communities that they serve in terms of people's needs or workforce and so on and so forth. So, I'm hopeful that is still, of value, and maybe we can use some of those as a segue to some of these, like overdraft protection, for example, or interchange or whatever. But that's the path that we usually go in this kind of situation. Great.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Anybody got any questions for Courtney at all, or any comments, any reaction to anything, any of these things you heard her touch on that you have further thoughts on? I'm not hearing a lot of people like knocking on the door wanting to jump in. So
Well,
like
we're
waiting.
excited to see you next week. I'm happy to hang out and take questions later if any come up.
Right.
Just, wear comfy shoes.
We will. We encourage people to do that. Okay. Well, if there's no questions for Courtney, thank you very much for that update on those issues. And we're going to jump to a state focus. Jessica Oski is no stranger to any of you on the line, except for maybe Courtney. But she's a familiar face to Vermont Credit Unions as a point person in the hallways of the Vermont Statehouse, where she is every single day that those lawmakers are in that Statehouse. And, I get to go in and, testify on issues and, shake hands with lawmakers and go to events and that kind of stuff. But Jessica is the one that's in the hallways all day long, every day, doing her sleuthing and detective work and whatnot and making things happen. So Jessica, thank you for joining us this afternoon to give us an update on what's hot in the Statehouse and that we ought to be paying attention to right now.
Thanks for having me. And it was really interesting to hear what's going on in Washington. Certainly lots of globally important things. I'm not going to talk about so many really important things, but the difference is that we actually can get things done here in Vermont and in Washington. Not a lot happens, maybe for the better. So we didn't come into this session, AVCU didn't come into this session with any priorities, but as what always happens, we get dragged into a number of things unexpectedly that impact credit unions. And I'm not going to go over everything that we're following. I'm going to touch on 4 things that kind of show the diversity of issues that we're working on. The first one, kind of a snoozer, but really important, called the Vermont Uniform Power of Attorney Act, also known as the UPOAA, in case you want to go in the shorthand. And this is in pursuit of standardized laws across the country. Most states have adopted the Uniform Power of Attorney Act in order to allow Americans, and in this case, Vermonters, to anticipate that their power of attorney agreement will be upheld if they move or travel to another state. And traditionally, powers of attorney are governed by state laws, and they often have really significant differences. So having a uniform power of attorney law that a number of states have adopted is helpful for consistency and being able to anticipate that your power of attorney or that your customer's power of attorney is going to be available and upheld wherever they are. As you all know, and you've probably dealt with power of attorneys, they are legally binding contractual agreements that assign decision-making ability to another individual. And they're important to CUs because you're probably often called upon to act by an agent pursuant to a power of attorney. So we're following this bill. As it was introduced, it went through the Uniform Laws Committee of the Bar Association, and it's in the House Judiciary Committee. And so far, the testimony has been kind of boring. Everyone is agreeable for the most part. There's a few little tweaks here and there, but we're going to keep following it, making sure that the language is clear and understandable, and as it relates to financial institutions, to make sure that it's consistent with what we need and want. And at this point it is. I think the bill will pass and we will have a uniform power of attorney law in Vermont. And at some point during the following of this, I will point out in our weekly update what are the differences between our existing law and the uniform law, so that you can be on the lookout for those. The second bill is one that, not surprisingly, we kind of got dragged into, and it is the H-171, a bill to amend the statutes regarding abuse, neglect, and exploitation of vulnerable adults. And we have, over the years, we've been brought into a number of bills that attempt to change the laws around protecting vulnerable adults from abuse. And obviously, credit unions care deeply about protecting their members, especially their vulnerable members, from exploitation and abuse and neglect. But this bill is a good example of why stakeholders should be brought together before a bill gets introduced, because as the bill was introduced, no financial institutions nor our regulator were consulted, and the bill as introduced has credit union employees becoming mandatory reporters of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, which comes with quite a lot of responsibility and quite a lot of consequences for not complying with the law. And it's not necessarily something that we wouldn't want to do, but it needs to be part of a conversation, because your employees aren't trained in what to look for and how to. I mean, you are to a certain degree. There are checks and balances that you have in place now, and if you see exploitation or something you're worried about, you can report it. But this would make you a mandated reporter, and so we've raised concerns, and our regulator, DFR, has raised concerns as well. And we expect that this section of the bill is going to be put off into a study, and which we would be included in, and we would come back to the legislature next January with recommendations. Maybe the recommendations would be that it makes sense for credit union employees to be mandatory reporters. But it needs to be well thought out, and that's the goal. So we raised our concerns to the committee. The committee heard us, and they're in the process now of marking up the bill, and we're hoping that this section becomes a study.
And if I can interject, Jessica, it may have
please.
changed since my reading of it, but when I read it the first time, I thought that besides credit union employees, that it also extended to, or would extend to, volunteers in credit unions as well. And it didn't spell out credit union volunteers, but it did spell out employees and volunteers of the affected organizations, which included credit unions. So yes, we do want to.
I mean, if your volunteers or your employees are mandatory reporters, you want to have a strong training program in place. Again, because with the obligation comes consequences for failing to report. The next bill that we're looking at, a little bit more fun and interesting, is Joe referred to it, is H-87, an act to regulate earned wage access services. And I never even knew that there was such a thing as earned wage access, but now I know quite a bit about earned wage access. And this concept is, you may all be familiar with it. It allows employees to access their earned wages or their earned pay prior to payday so that they can tap into their earned pay to meet, potentially unexpected expenses without having to pay late fees, overdraft fees, or resort to what we already prohibit in Vermont, which is predatory payday lenders. There's a couple different models out there, and this bill was promoted by a company called Earnin, which is a direct-to-consumer model. There's another model that is embedded with employers. Employers offer it as a benefit to their employees, kind of low-wage employers. And we're watching it really to make sure that there's strong consumer protections in there. As Joe mentioned in his conversation with Courtney, it's never really a good thing to need to access your wages before your paycheck comes out. Like, it's a sign that you're not earning enough and you've got expenses and a lot of people are in that situation. So we just wanted to make sure that if it's our members that are getting access to their wages, that there's strong consumer protections in place in this bill. And this is all new to DFR. And as Joe said, we would be the first state to regulate. So it's going to be slow and deliberate. It was starting off very fast, but I think the committee chair realizes that there's a lot at stake. And if Vermont goes down this path of regulating this industry, other states are going to follow. So we better get it right.
It was interesting, Jessica, that and you and I talked about this before, that of course, Earnin was the proponent of this particular legislation. So it was crafted to suit their means of their structure, their form of operation. But as a committee contacted other competitors of theirs who operate differently and have different ways of getting revenue and whatnot, that they weren't, the three organizations and maybe others weren't overtly conflicting with each other, but you could tell that, they each wanted it to be written differently to suit whatever their needs are. Because you're talking about, an industry that's been in existence for a decade with no regulation, no uniformity. They're all out there doing their own thing because they're not making loans. So, there's been no regulatory oversight. It's just kind of an interesting.
They're not technically making loans, but
right.
They, the ones that are embedded with their employer, they verify that they've worked the hours and that they're entitled to the pay before they're given it, before they receive it. But if they're direct to consumer, they might, they don't have the ability to verify. So they take the person's word for it. And if they don't get paid, then, there may be not the ability to recapture the funds. And so it's debt. But anyway, so we're watching that, and we'll be keeping an eye on the consumer protections in there. The last bill I'm going to talk about is a really lovely bill, and it probably won't go anywhere this year, although I wish it would. And it's H226, an act relating to financial literacy in Vermont's public schools. And it would be great if this did pass. This bill would. There's nothing more than we like than financial literacy. This bill was introduced with broad tripartisan support. Its lead sponsor is the chair of the Commerce Committee, Representative Marcotte, and the bill would require students in Vermont public schools to complete a course on personal finance as a condition of being awarded a high school diploma. And it also requires the State Board of Ed to adopt standards for student performance in the content area of financial literacy and to supervise the implementation of the financial literacy course. It may get some traction in the biennium, but maybe not this first half of the biennium. And it would be, great opportunity for credit unions, AVCU or individual credit unions to talk to lawmakers about the importance of financial literacy. So those are there's other bills that we're following, but those are the ones that I wanted to highlight for you today.
The links to all of those bills, by the way, are in the chat box in your side window if you care to take a look at any of them. Thank you, Jessica, for that update. Any questions or comments for Jessica or Courtney on anything at all that, even if you haven't heard of it, anything that comes to mind that you want to find out about?
I love the fact that they're finally starting to require financial literacy in high schools. It's the only place that it's possible to get it, and it should have been required a long time ago. So thank you. Thank you for your update.
You're welcome.
I have a call with advocacy people from other state association credit union leagues and CUNA every week, and just had it just before this meeting. And for a few years now, we've heard about a lot of legislatures introducing different forms of financial literacy requirements in typically the high school level, not always. In a lot of states, and I don't know what's going to happen here, Jessica, in a lot of states, it's the Teachers Association that opposes it on the basis of, only having so many hours in a day kind of thing and all that kind of stuff. So I think the devil's in the details of how it gets mandating it, is great. The devil's in the details of how is the school system going to actually incorporate it. And some of them have been, some states, it sounds like they've incorporated it into existing courses of study, while others, have made it like, I think the Vermont approach would be an entirely separate kind of on its own kind of course. So I'll be interested to see what happens with this. I know that the financial literacy, and I forget what the right name for it is, at Champlain College, that we were involved with in some years ago when it was first created. I don't know if they still do it, but they did have a program, a residency program each summer for, I don't know if it was a week or 10 days or something like that, where teachers from high schools throughout the state would go to Champlain College and take this course of how to integrate financial literacy into whatever they were teaching, be it science or English or math or whatever else. And, I heard some testimonials from some teachers who were very appreciative of that, going through it, because it helped them themselves in their everyday lives, have a better handle on financial literacy and making their lives better. So, but one step at a time. Other comments or questions from anybody for Courtney or Jessica at all? Hey, well, thank you very much, ladies, for joining us. And thank you to all the rest of you for taking time out of your day. We're giving about 20 minutes back to you for your afternoon. So go enjoy your next 20 minutes. For those of you that are going to join us in DC, we'll look forward to that. And I'll give a plug here for mark April 14th on your calendar for our Credit Union Day in the Statehouse. Things are different in the Statehouse this year than they were last year, than they were for the 2 years before that. So we don't know exactly what form that's going to take, but we will have a Credit Union Day in the Statehouse and try to gather as many Vermont Credit Union people in that building as possible on April 14th. So be sure to mark that on your calendar. And with that, I think we're at the end. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate it.